stormwater management construction grant. Just let me click the got it button. Thank you for recording, Whitney. And yeah, just want to congratulate all of you for receiving at least one construction grant award this year. Some of you have received 2. And so today we're going to walk you through different facets of the grant process, all with the hope of helping you administer your grant, and hoping that we're going to address some frequently asked questions and provide some tips to avoid problems before they arise. Some of you are newbies to the Urban Nonpoint Source grant program. You'll see it shortened to UNPS throughout the presentation. But some of you are veterans, and some of this will be a good refresher for you as you administer your new grant award. But really, our hope is, you know, like I said, ask and answer questions up front, so that ultimately we provide and prevent any delays and complications later on, particularly with the ever important reimbursement process. So we'll dive in now. So today we're going to go through, like I said, the main parts of the grant process. You have all been awarded your grant agreement, but then we're going to talk about various required pre-approvals, the reimbursement request process, grant amendments and variances, and then ultimately final report requirements. So let's dive into the first part of the process. And like I said, those of you, all of you should have received your grant agreement late last year. I'd probably say about 2/3 of you have already signed your grant agreement and returned it to me, which is great. Those of you that have not, some of you have communicated to me that you're waiting on committee or council or board approvals, which is totally fine. I appreciate that you've gotten in touch with me to at least let me know the status of things. All grantees have until March 1st to sign their grants. So if you haven't reached out to me to let me know the status, please do, just so we can keep tabs on whether or not you'll be accepting the grant or not. One thing I will say is, you know, if you haven't done so already, please read your grant agreement document. We're not going to go through it right now. You all have it in hand, but it's really important that you do read through it because it serves as the foundation for a lot of the other things that we're going to talk about today. So, you know, take the time to read it. It's not too long of a document, and I think ultimately it'll help you be successful later on as you implement your projects. And, you know, you're not in this alone. We have regional non-point source coordinators throughout the state that help you ultimately implement your projects and make sure that they're successful. You should all know who your regional non-point coordinator is. You all had to get in touch with them during the application process and discuss your projects with them. So if you don't know, if you're new to your municipality, here they are. And we do have a map, interactive map on the DNR website showing which coordinators are assigned to which counties in the state. We do have a vacancy in Oshkosh. Eric Evanson is now a DNR water quality biologist, and we hope to be filling his position very soon. Those of you that are in Northeast region that may have been assigned to Eric's counties, you can contact Erin Hansen. She is in our Green Bay office and is covering temporarily while the Oshkosh vacancy position is getting filled. Otherwise, hopefully all these names look familiar to you, or at least one of these names looks familiar to you for your part of the state. We also have staff in central office that help to implement the non-point source program on a statewide basis. You'll see Joanna's name, my name listed there for the non-point source and the runoff management grants. I also administer the targeted runoff management grant. Joanne and I both, as a team, administer the targeted runoff management grants, as well as the Urban Nonpoint Source construction and planning grants. Mike Gilbertson is also the notice of discharge grant coordinator on the ag side of things. And I just want to reiterate or remind everybody that, you know, your regional non-point coordinator is your main point of contact during the life of your grant. So when you have a question, we recommend that you contact your regional non-point source coordinator first. So we'll move right along to the kind of the next phase of the grant process, assuming everybody's got their grant agreements in and you're got your project ready to go and ready to roll. The next thing we'll cover is various required pre-approvals. So here is a list of really the main ones. Those of you that you know, sought force account as part of your grant, force account funding as part of your grant, you essentially received approval for having a force account budget line in your grant via the adding of that budget line in your grant agreement. So if you don't have a budget line for force account, AKA using your own staff to do certain elements or certain parts of your construction project, if you don't have that budget line in your grant agreement, then you are not eligible to receive reimbursement for that purpose. So if you have it in your grant, you've been approved and you're good to go. Anybody that is working on construction projects you're very likely going to be hiring professional service contractors, engineers, either to do design or various engineering services, maybe construction oversight. And any professional service agreements need to be approved prior to actually executing those agreements. And also, you know, as you're settling in on the design for your practices, the construction plans and specifications also need to be approved in advance prior to construction of the practices. Some of your projects may include land acquisition, property acquisition, either in fee title, usually in fee title, sometimes for easements. There are certain steps in that process that require pre-approval in terms of needing a land acquisition proposal in advance and getting an appraisal approved in advance prior to moving through that land acquisition process. And some of you, actually, I just want to make note of that little bullet there, that little asterisk. Some of you may already have your designs done. They may have been done before you even applied for your grant. They still need to be looked at, and any professional service agreements for that purpose should be looked at by DNR staff before actually implementing your practices. And design costs are eligible retroactively as long as you have a design and engineering budget line in your grant agreement. And I think I may have mentioned this, but really the two most common pre-approvals that you're going to be dealing with are the two that I just highlighted. Pretty much everybody is going to have some sort of professional service agreement or construction contract. And all of you are going to be having essentially construction plans and specs that need to get approved. So just to point out some of the code language that goes along with this, there is existing code authority to require these approvals. And you also have grant conditions in your grant agreement that specify this. So it's really important that you get these approvals done before construction begins. And you will be working in concert with your regional non-point source coordinator, and in many cases, your local regional stormwater engineer. So much of the Urban Nonpoint Source and Stormwater Management Grant Program is helping to achieve compliance with your municipal stormwater permit. It's not actually non-point source pollution per se. You're dealing more with the permitted stormwater side of things. And so we very much act as a team with our stormwater program staff to ensure that the work products that you're developing and constructing are going to help you achieve compliance with your permit. Hence the need for a lot of these pre-approvals. So speaking of, this is essentially what a pre-approval or approval letter will look like. You should be receiving a letter. It could be including review and approval of your plans and specs, and or it could be a combined letter approving your professional service agreement prior to going out for bids, ideally. You know, and so what you're seeing here is an example of an approval letter from a stormwater engineer on DNR letterhead that outlines those approvals. And we'll dive into a little bit of the details on this so you can see what this type of approval includes. So first off, up at the top, hopefully you can all see that. Sometimes the Zoom meeting bar gets in the way, but essentially what it's doing here is identifying that this approval is for the plans and specs, as well as for the professional service agreement bid documents, and that they have in fact been approved. This next section lists the BMPs and the various construction activities that are included in the approval. And it shows the estimated total design and construction costs for the project. Next in that bullet is the maximum grant award and the maximum cost share rate that is applicable to the project. And in this case, that first bullet was for the actual construction part. This particular letter also is approving the cost share rate and the maximum reimbursement amount for the engineering part of the project. Next in the numbered section, your approval may have certain conditions tied with it that are specified by the stormwater engineer. Certain things that will likely be very project specific. And like I said, last but not least, your approval letter will be signed, or will need to be signed by a stormwater engineer. All right. And we will have opportunities to ask questions. I think what we'll do is we'll go through the reimbursement request section, and then we'll pause there, and that can be the opportunity to discuss some questions. But don't hesitate to send your questions to Joanna. So I think, you know, this is the part of the process that most everyone is interested in. Is you've all worked hard to implement your practices and get them installed, and you want to get your hands on the grant funding. So DNR has a form for this. There is a request for reimbursement form on the DNR website for the Urban Nonpoint Source grant program. It's form 8700-336. And so it's a fillable PDF form that you can use, and we're going to walk through some of the details of that. But kind of some overarching things to point out. It's really important that you provide all of the required information in the reimbursement request. That information helps us document how the state money is being spent, and have it be consistent and spent in accordance with any of the state rules, statutes, and funding requirements. And both for us and for you, it's important to be able to document and report out on what was done for the sake of maybe your local reporting and audit requirements, but certainly also the state reporting and audit requirements. Now, in terms of construction projects, in terms of when you can seek reimbursement, you know, we would ask that you really cannot seek reimbursement for your practices until they are fully installed. So, you know, if you have a grant that, you know, let's say it's for the construction of a wet pond, that wet pond needs to be essentially deemed fully installed to the technical standards, and before you can seek reimbursement. And a lot of this requirement is centered around the bond council. Urban Nonpoint Source grant construction grants are funded with bond revenue. And it is essentially a requirement of our state bond council for good reason, that they want to see that the funding is being put towards something that is fully installed and ready to go and implement and operate. So that's really key. With your final reimbursement request, many Urban Nonpoint Source projects essentially have one reimbursement request. You go through the construction phase to implement your practices and ultimately come in with one final reimbursement request. Those reimbursement requests can be submitted at any time. If you happen to implement your project in the first year of your grant, great. If it's towards the second year of your grant, minimally at the very latest, that final reimbursement needs to be submitted within 60 days after the end date of your grant, which in most cases is December 31st. So that in a lot of cases, that's March 1st. So get it by March 1st. Your grants are starting in 23. They're going to end at the end of 24. And so by March 1st of 25, you need to get that final reimbursement request in at the very latest. And something to point out, this does not pertain so much to you as municipal grantees. We do have some Urban Nonpoint Source construction grants that are done by municipalities working with landowners on private property. In those cases, we have a cost share agreement form that you can use to enter into a cost share agreement if that private landowner is going to receive cost sharing funds through the Urban Nonpoint Source grant. And we actually will reimburse the recording fees. That cost share agreement needs to be recorded on the deed in many cases then. And recording fees for that process, that purpose, are an eligible cost. But when you talk about just Urban Nonpoint Source construction projects in general, and particularly ones that have land acquisition, it's really important for you to know that state and local permit fees are not eligible for reimbursement. And then a lot of these other things that are listed are those things that are needed potentially for property acquisition. You can see them listed here. Those are other things that are not eligible for reimbursement. So just some key points to help you along with this process. All design costs to be reimbursed are for the design, need to be for the design of the constructed BMPs included in the grant agreement. So if you've got a larger project with practices that are not part of the grant, we will be looking to ensure that the design costs that you're seeking reimbursement for are in fact for the practices that are part of the grant agreement, even though you may have a consultant that's designing a whole bunch of different things and they could be included on the same invoices. All of the design costs to be reimbursed need to have been incurred either before or during the grant period. Like I said, we can pay for design retroactively once the practices are fully installed. So if design happened prior to the grant award, that's fine. Otherwise, the design needs to be happening during the grant period. All construction costs need to be incurred during the grant period as well in order to be eligible for reimbursement. It's not unheard of for some projects maybe to go down to the wire and your consultants maybe bill you that last invoice after the grant period ends. That's okay, as long as we can tell and that the construction work actually happened during the grant period. So we'll be looking for that. So to the extent that you can make sure your contractors are clear in their invoicing, that's really, really helpful, and it'll speed up the reimbursement process. So your grant has budget lines both for construction and design and engineering activities. Those are separate budget lines. And then you also, in some cases, may have a property acquisition budget line. Your reimbursement request essentially needs to stay and cannot exceed those respective budget lines. If you think that there's going to be some changes in cost in your project where you think maybe you're not going to have as much engineering cost, you will need to request a grant amendment to do a budget line item transfer. If construction comes in under budget, but engineering costs more, again, that's something where those budget lines essentially serve as caps. And we can't actually move that funding around unless we have some justification and notice about those changes in costs. So just know that those are caps. And if you think that the cost of things are going to change, you're going to need to require or request a grant amendment. And I already touched on this, that all construction costs to be reimbursed both for the practices and any of the ancillary activities, they need to be completely installed. So we're going to touch a little bit on the force account side of things. Those of you that have a force account award, you know, as I mentioned before, that's where you are using your own employees or equipment to help in doing some of the work associated with the project. Only Urban Nonpoint Source construction applicants can apply for that force account, and it's capped at 5% of the total project reimbursement, you know, associated with the actual total BMP costs, essentially the total project reimbursement for the BMPs. And so, you know, force account in general can only be reimbursed then with the final grant settlement, the final grant reimbursement, because we're going to be determining what that amount is that achieves that 5% cap based on the total cost of the practice construction that was done. And this is just a reminder that, you know, this essentially the written approval that's required by code happened by virtue of, you know, you having a budget line in your grant agreement. So it's already been approved if you have that budget line in your grant agreement, and you're good to go. Okay, so we're going to dive into completing the reimbursement form. You know, again, thankfully this webinar is being recorded, so you do have the ability to come back to this when you get to that point in your grant administration. For some of you, that might be a couple years down the road. And the good thing is we do have an instruction document and checklist that's on the reimbursement tab of the Urban Nonpoint Source grant website. When you are filling out the form, I highly recommend that you take as much information from your grant agreement to then populate the associated data fields on the reimbursement form. You know, again, to keep things as consistent as possible from the beginning of the grant process to the end is really makes things go a lot faster in terms of getting you your payment. I just put the Urban Nonpoint Source grant website web link there. And I will ask too that you always download the reimbursement form from the website each time that you're going to request reimbursement. For some of you, again, that might just be one time. But we want to make sure that you're always using the most current version of the reimbursement form. And we had a targeted runoff management grant webinar this morning, and I apologize to the group because some of you I know already have cursed having to use DNR forms for probably for your grant application. DNR is working towards hopefully at some point in the near future adopting some new forms technology, new forms software. I actually offered up our reimbursement form as a pilot for trying out some new software for DNR forms. It hasn't been finalized yet. But in the meantime, while we've been waiting for that, I have not sought updates to the existing reimbursement form because I was hoping that the new form was going to come, the new version was going to come sooner. But I will very likely be making some updates to particularly some of the urban components of the reimbursement form in the very near future, because I just don't think we can afford to wait. So you're going to see some things in some of the screenshots today that are of the existing form that I would like to address in a near future update. So please download the most current version of the form to make sure you're using the best and current one. And I talked about the instructions and checklist already. All right, so we're going to dive into page 1 of the reimbursement form. Pretty straightforward. You know, again, you're going to take information from your grant agreement, list your governmental unit name, tell us where to mail the check to. As you send your grant agreement back to me, you're also sending me an up-to-date project contact sheet. Some things change between the point of sending in your application to actually getting your grant award. So we have you fill out that project contact page. Have it be consistent information from that. Your project name should come from your grant agreement. Your grant number is actually on your grant agreement, your cost share rate percentage, and list what pay request number this is. Is it pay request number 1, 2, etc. And then lastly, on this section, you know, again, the period that's covered by your request, it may end up being the whole grant period or maybe a part of it. But just remember that any work that you are requesting reimbursement for had to have occurred during the grant period. Even if the invoice came outside of the grant period, you have to be able to show us that the implementation and the construction work happened during the grant period. And let us know if this is a partial or a final request. I think that really the only way a construction applicant or grantee could request a partial is maybe you've got multiple practices in your grant award. If you fully install one of 3 practices, you could seek reimbursement for that fully installed practice, and then come in with a final reimbursement down the road for the remaining practices. And in your case, you're going to be checking the box for Urban Nonpoint Source construction. Moving down page 1, you're going to see a table. Some of these fields are going to be ones that you need to fill in. Some of them are going to be ones that will self-populate based on how you fill in other parts of the form. So starting out, you're going to put in your total grant award amount. If you don't have any prior reimbursements, that will obviously be 0 in row B. Otherwise, you want to just put a cumulative total of the reimbursement amounts that you've already sought and have been awarded. Row 2A is actually going to be populated from how you fill out table 1 on the next page of the form. And that's going to show what your actual requested reimbursement amount is. And then ultimately, the form will show what your grant balance is after everything above it is factored in. And then you can leave this far right column blank. I'll be using that as I review the reimbursement request. And then last but not least on page 1 is the certification section. You should have your authorized government official, that same person that signed your grant agreement, have them sign the form either with a wet signature or type their name in, and have them then submit the form directly to us via their email address. So just know that either of those methods is fine as long as it's coming from the authorized government official. And speaking of, all of you should have provided an authorizing resolution with your grant application and or your grant award. If anything has changed, please make sure that you keep that resolution up to date. We always recommend that grantees and applicants for these grants try to keep their resolutions as generic as possible so that you have to change it as seldom as possible, to the extent that your committees or councils or boards will allow you to do that. So, you know, your authorizing resolution can be the same from year to year if it's specifying the program rather than a specific project. It can also be the same from year to year if you're continuing to apply for grants, if you're using position titles rather than people's names. So just a few tips there. The bulleted list are those things that, you know, we're going to essentially be expecting authorized representatives to be signing and have that authority to sign. So just know that we have this template. If you want to polish up your resolution, we have this template in a Word document on the Urban Nonpoint Source Grant website. All right, so moving on to page 2 of the reimbursement request form. I'm going to take a quick sip of water here. Moving on to page 2, you're going to see that there's a table 1 and a table 2. And we're going to go through how to fill out these 2 tables so that hopefully when you get to that point, it's going to be a lot easier for you rather than guessing. So you can see here pretty basic information. Cost share recipient in the case of your grants is usually you, the municipality. Again, I said if you happen to be working with private landowners and they are receiving cost sharing funds from your grant, you will be entering into a cost share agreement with them, and they would be the cost share recipients. You're going to identify your practices. Each row should have a different practice in it. Units of measurement will automatically populate based on what practice you choose. The amount of or the number of units of that particular practice that you installed, total BMP costs, state cost share percentage, eligible state share based on your cost share percentage in your grant. But then ultimately the amount that you're requesting up to that eligible state share will be filled out in this next column. And you should always be able to tell us that a practice was completely installed. Really, the only folks that can say no to this question are Urban Nonpoint Source planning grantees. We do allow for Urban Nonpoint Source planning grantees to come in for partial reimbursements on planning activities, but we also withhold 50% of their eligible costs until the final reimbursement. So really, like I've drilled in multiple times now, you need to have fully completed practices. All right, so diving into the details. Again, cost share recipient would be you, whatever municipality you are coming from. And here's an example of where we need some updates in the form. This list of practices is woefully out of date. We do have updated codes. You will see those updated codes listed in the list of practices that's actually specified in your grant agreement. I'm expecting that this form will get updated before any of you are seeking reimbursement, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. Otherwise, you could just simply write them in if you're going to implement your practice by May of this year. Who knows, you know? But I really hope that literally within the next couple of months, we're going to get this form updated. So just know that that practice list is out of date. So again, some tips. Each practice has to have its own line, and the form actually forces you to do that. So each row has a different practice or activity included in it. You can't combine practices in one line. The reimbursement request column must specify the amount of reimbursement sought. We're not going to assume that you want the eligible state share. Particularly in projects that are bumping up against the grant cap or exceeding the grant cap, your eligible state share may be well above, it's factoring in the cost share rate, but it still may be well above what your grant cap is. And so you need to tell us within your grant award amount that which you are seeking reimbursement for. So in the case of this project, they're not seeking the full state share for every facet. They're only seeking $50,000, even though eligible cost share could be as high as $75,000 for the state share. And I do recommend that, you know, when you have multiple invoices for multiple practices or even one practice, it's really helpful that you notate on those invoices, those proofs of purchase, what BMPs those invoices are for. It helps really speed things up both for your regional nonpoint coordinator and me in the review and approval process. And, you know, especially in cases where a portion of an invoice, if only a portion of an invoice is being sought for reimbursement, please note on the invoice or create a separate spreadsheet for the costs that are being sought for reimbursement that are eligible. So clearly identifying those things that are tied to your reimbursement request it's really important, and it will help, help things go much more quickly. We understand that a lot of your projects are tied with other activities going on in your municipality. There may be road work, other utility work happening, and you may be getting invoices that include a whole host of activities. So noting on your invoices those things that are being sought for the Urban Nonpoint grant is really helpful. All right. Move along here. All right, so now we're going to move to table 2. You have to make sure that all sections in table 2 are filled in. And you can see that, again, we are looking for proofs of purchase as opposed to proof of payment. So we're looking for invoices usually. There are other acceptable document types here, but generally what we see are invoices. In the next column, you're going to want to put the document number from that invoice. If there is no invoice number, you can put the date. You should select a BMP code that invoice is tied to. So essentially what you're doing here now is reconciling your reimbursement documentation with the practices that you're seeking reimbursement for up in table 1. Here in this next column, DNR funding amount, you're going to put the dollar amount that is being requested from that particular invoice. So you have a certain practice that was a part of that invoice, and you're going to tell us what part of that invoice is the DNR funding amount. And then next, the remaining part of that practice that is the non-DNR funding amount. So that could be the amount that the city is going to pay or the village is going to pay as the local share. Or maybe you have other funding sources at play. And speaking of, we want you to tell us what the non-DNR funding sources are. That section does need to be completed. It could be you again as the landowner and the municipal grantee. Maybe again you have other funding or grant programs at play there to help pay the non-DNR amount. So here now you can see an example where you've got table 1 and table 2 together, and you're going to see the connections between the two. So you can see here in the yellow circles or ovals, the total BMP expenses in table 1 matches the grand total in table 2. That's what we want to see. So what you've told us has been done in table 1 should match the grand total of all of the invoicing and documentation you provided in table 2. And then the reimbursement request total should also match the DNR funding amount total in table 2. So we want to see that corresponding, those corresponding amounts. All right. So here's another example where table 1 and table 2 have been filled out. Each line in table 1 is for a separate BMP, and each one has an associated proof of purchase in table 2. And so you can see that the BMP code for each one is selected in table 2 with the same color scheme. So each proof of purchase in table 2 for which reimbursement is being sought will have a separate line for a separate practice. So you can see here that Jones Contractors, this is invoice 456789, is listed twice. And the reason it's listed twice is because you have to parse out and show that that invoice helped to pay not just for storm sewer rerouting, but also some structure removal. And so you're telling us that portion of that same invoice that is attributed to those practices up in table 1 and the associated funding amount that you're requesting. So it can get a little tricky, particularly when you've got multiple contractors, helping to install the various practices in your project, multiple invoices, multiple contractors. So coming back to the folks that have force account, Whenever you are seeking your final reimbursement and you are hoping to receive reimbursement for the force account amount in your grant, you will also not only need to fill out the associated line in the reimbursement form for force account, you'll use BMP code R54. You will also have to complete and submit a force account certification form that you see here. That is no surprise, also on the DNR website for the Urban Nonpoint Source grant program. And it's another example where you're going to be pulling information, trying to be as consistent with your grant agreement as possible in terms of Section A. You're then going to go to the bottom part of Section A and tell us what type of force account expense you are seeking reimbursement for. And in most cases, it's going to be labor. And so by checking C, that's going to open up part C of the form over here, and you'll fill out that part of the certification form. And by filling that out, then it comes back to part B here and provides a summary. This will be auto-populated based on the information you put in part C. And then you can see here in this particular example, $540 is the total cost of the labor that was associated with the project, the associated cost share amount. That's the kind of information that you will then be bringing over to the reimbursement form as the total cost of force account, the associated cost share rate, and then the eligible state share. You'll then have to also tell us the amount you're actually seeking for reimbursement. So coming back to the reimbursement form, the last section is the project status and verification. If you happen to be doing a partial reimbursement, you would need to provide a project status report and just be a brief description of what's happening with your project. If you're coming up against delays, we assume that something's happening because you're coming in for reimbursement. But if there's certain problems or delays or modifications that have to happen, you can briefly describe them there. Some of those project changes may be things that kind of flag us for a grant amendment. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but this just gives us a heads up as to what you've been going through. If there's anything that we can do to help, if you haven't already communicated to your Urban Nonpoint Source coordinator about that. All practices need to be verified by you as the grantee and certified then that they've been checked. We're looking to make sure that they're following appropriate technical standards and the plans and specs that were approved by the department. And then you can, I'm always forgetting my animations here. Last but not least, you can just leave the last section blank because that's where our regional nonpoint coordinator will let us know that they've looked at the reimbursement and are sending it then on to me to finish processing. So there, I will pause. I'm going to have some water.
Great, thanks, Corinne. So just as a reminder to everyone, please send your questions to Joanna, the Q&A monitor. We do have one question that has come in so far, and I do have a follow-up response for this. And then, Corinne, if you have anything else that you'd like to add, feel free to add on to this. So the question is, what is the anticipated turnaround time on the pre-approval review process for the PSA plans and specs? And so Amy, engineer who reviews many of these plans and specs, she said that about 3 weeks for this to happen. We do try to do it more quickly if possible for plans and specs, and then the regional grant staff will review the PSA. So I don't know if you have anything else that you'd like to add on to that, Corinne, for that question.
No, I want to first off thank Amy for taking a crack at responding to that. We, like I said early on, we are very much in partnership with stormwater program staff and engineers. So yes, so you can expect about 3 weeks for your plan and spec review. It's anywhere from about 2 to 3 weeks for PSA approval. Obviously good communication is always important. If for some reason you need something faster, communicate with your regional nonpoint coordinator. But generally we like to be given about that amount of time in fairness to workloads, because Certainly, your project is not the only one that we're looking at. A lot of people are on the same kind of timelines in terms of construction season. So work can really ebb and flow in that regard. So, but again, PSA, probably that 2 to 3 week, plans and specs, 3 weeks, maybe longer.
Great, thank you for that. I am not seeing any other questions coming in right now. If something does pop up, please feel free to put the questions in at any point, and we can always circle back to questions for this section. But
All
I will
right.
pass it back to you, Corinne. All
right, sounds good. Thank you. All right, so we're now moving on to section 4. We're going to talk about amendments and variances. As much as we'd like to hope that our projects are going to go exactly as we had hoped and planned, sometimes changes and changes are needed to just adapt to changing situations. So we're going to dive into this part of the grant process. Okay, so what is a grant amendment? Essentially, it's a change to one or more conditions of your grant agreement. In general, if you think things are changing in your project for any reason, and something that you think is not consistent with what you applied for in your grant application and is outlined in your grant agreement, get in touch with your regional non-point coordinator ASAP, okay? So you really should be requesting any kind of amendment. We're going to go through the different types certainly before the grant period ends. And you really should do it before taking any kind of action or incurring any project costs that are inconsistent with your grant agreement. So, if you're incurring something that's ineligible under the grant agreement or in excess of one of your budget lines, that can be a problem. So you want to talk about that before it happens. If you think you're going to be adding or eliminating, I'm sorry, I got planning deliverable, I meant construction deliverable there. If you're going to be adding or eliminating a BMP that was included or not included in your grant, you're going to need a grant amendment for that. And if you're changing the location of your BMP, you definitely need a grant amendment for that purpose. So those are some examples. You really, before you do anything, talk to your non-point coordinator and we'll walk you through the amendment process. So again, the amendment types. The most common type are requests to extend the grant period. All of you have 2-year grants at this point. You do have the potential, it's not guaranteed, but you may request with justification a time extension amendment prior to your grant expiring. So you do have the ability to potentially get a 1-year grant extension. Budget amendments, again, if you think that there's going to be an increase in the state share amount of your project, and you'd like to try to request more funding up to the grant cap amount, if you haven't already hit the grant cap, then you could try. Can't guarantee it. If we don't have any funding available, we can't approve a budget increase. But maybe you want to again transfer funding between budget lines, between engineering and construction, based on how your project is evolving. Make sure you do that before you request reimbursement. Again, scope changes. Sometimes you realize you got to add or replace BMPs in a given project for whatever reason. Sometimes you need to change the location of the BMP. And I swear I thought I went through this and got everything changed to construction, but clearly I didn't. So it would be changing the location of your actual practice siting. We want to know that. You are all given points based on placing your practices in a given watershed with a given water quality need, and that impacted your score ultimately. And so we want to make sure that you're not essentially moving your project to an area that would have scored differently in the rank list for the projects. And then if there's any other change that comes up, it may kind of just fall in the other category. And so again, best to just get in touch with your regional non-point coordinator and talk through things before you implement something that's just not consistent with your grant agreement. And so, like with most everything, we have a form for that. There is a grant amendment request form on the DNR Urban Nonpoint Source grant website. You can see here that we have a list of brief questions. A lot of them are yes or no. That helps walk you through kind of, envisioning what you're actually seeking. And I'm noticing here that there's like a text bubble that got moved. Scope amendment should actually be replacing what we used to call a substitution request. This little text bubble should be down here. But this just helps you walk through to help you determine and be very clear to us what kind of amendment you're seeking. Is it going to be an extension amendment? Is it going to be a scope amendment? Is it a budget amendment, whether it's a budget increase, decrease, or budget line item transfer? And here you can see a completed version of the form. Again, pretty quick to do. There is another page of questions that you will need to answer depending on what kind of amendment you're seeking. Filling out this form for time extension requests, really easy. It probably will take you 5 minutes to fill this out to request a time extension. You do need to provide justification though, really, for any amendments though that you're requesting. So just be prepared to do that. So variances. We don't do a lot of these, thankfully, because we really strive to implement the program consistent with Administrative Code chapters NR 154 and 155. Sometimes we will approve these exceptions to a requirement in the code. So what are the instances when a variance would be allowed? If we, in terms of what you present to us in your request, if we think it's necessary and essential to essentially implement your grant effectively and meet your water quality objectives, or if we think that you've got special circumstances in your project that make it really in the best interest of the program, we're going to be looking for that kind of information in your request. So tell the story of why you think it's needed and why it's to the benefit of your project and the program to do something that is an exception to the code. There are limitations to this though. If a requirement is in statutes, the administrative rules essentially implement the statutes. The statutes are kind of the high authority. If something is in statute, we cannot grant variances to those things that are in statute. So something to keep in mind. Most common type of variance is extending the grant period beyond the maximum that's allowed in code. Right now, your projects are 2-year projects. You may be given a 1-year extension. In limited circumstances, we've extended beyond. But again, there has to be something that's beyond your control that justifies the need for that added extension. And one that I can think of is there have been things with regarding to delays in TMDL development or TMDL implementation type things and how that affects your stormwater permits, primarily in finishing TMDLs and getting them done in time. This is mostly on the planning side for modifying your stormwater management plans and such. So, again, there has to be some justification for why you would extend, say, into a 4th year. COVID was a good one as an example, both for planning and construction. So there is code language behind this, and there are expectations in terms of what you submit. We would ask that when you submit a request, it can be an email, doesn't have to be on letterhead, but it should be coming from your authorized representative, citing the specific section and code, and we can help you with that to really pinpoint that. And again, providing that justification. We then have a DNR grants team. Once you submit it to the regional non-point coordinator and they give us the thumbs up to move forward with approving it, we have a DNR grants team that will review it. It is a multi-program team from our Watershed Bureau, Watershed Management, aka our runoff management program, managers and staff, Joanna being one of them, and then also managers and staff in the bureau that I'm in the Bureau of Community Financial Assistance. We meet on a monthly basis, work through a whole host of grant-related issues each month, and keep the programs going. But we also review variance requests during those meetings. And if it's approved, we would be making that recommendation. Then ultimately, you're going to get a letter from the bureau director. My bureau director in the Bureau of Community Financial Assistance is Jim Ritchie. You would be getting a letter on DNR letterhead from him saying that it's approved, or potentially saying it's not approved. We'll point that out. Like I said, regional staff sending and making that recommendation of approval to essentially management in central office is not an approval. So that email, they may copy you on that email, but that is not an approval. You should be looking for a letter on DNR letterhead from the Bureau of Community Financial Assistance. And I'm mainly saying those things because we've had instances where there's been a miscommunication about that, and we want to prevent that from happening. We don't want anybody to misinterpret an email. We want it to be very clear that you should be looking for that letter from the Bureau Director. All right, so last but not least is the final report. Everybody needs to do a final report. It's just one way to show the good work that you've done with the grant funding. So all of you at the end of your projects, after implementing your practices, will need to do the report. And it should be submitted no later than the time that you are submitting the final reimbursement. You could send the final report in prior to submitting the final reimbursement, that's fine. But a lot of you will probably end up just submitting it right around the same time. And again, the deadline is the same as the final reimbursement. You need to get it done 60 days, within 60 days of the end of the grant period. And that's usually March 1st. The final reimbursement cannot be processed until the final report is approved, both by the regional non-point coordinator and by those of us in central office tying it to the final reimbursement. So happily, we no longer have a form for this. We used to have a fillable PDF form for the final report. Now you will be using, as of late last year, we have transitioned to having final reports for the urban construction grant program submitted through DNR's BMP implementation tracking system. So best management practice implementation tracking system, or BITS for short. And you can see the home page for BITS on the screen here. And a little bit about BITS. So you can see a little snippet from the BITS website homepage. It's a web-based, GIS-based data system. The data elements that we're having you complete in BITS are essentially equivalent to what was in the old PDF form. You're not alone. Both notice of discharge and targeted runoff management grantees prior to Urban Nonpoint grants have already been using BITS for a couple of years now to do their final reports. And we're also working currently on the development of a module in BITS for Urban Nonpoint Source planning grant final reports. So just know if any of you are maybe have active planning grants or will be applying in the future, you too will be supplying your final report in BITS. So we're not going to go through a full-on training session of BITS and how to submit your final report. And that's because we have a lot of resources on the DNR website for that purpose. And it's a ways off into the future anyway. So it gives you some time to dive into those resources and learn the system as you implement your project. So on the Urban Nonpoint Source grant website, we have mention of the final report form requirement. We have new mention, we'll be modifying that header there, but we have new mention as of December 5th. We are expecting that you guys use BITS. And there's a link then to the BITS webpage. On the BITS website, there's a whole host of training resources. There's a user manual that walks you through the report process step by step. There's a quick reference guide. There's a video on how to submit your Urban Nonpoint Source construction final report. We've had webinars. So those are there. The slide deck from that webinar is there for your reference. One of the good things about BITS is that this is more so for projects that have a lot of practices, but maybe you'll find it worthwhile too. You have the ability to load your data into a shapefile, and we have a template for that purpose. If your municipality is GIS savvy, we give you some guidance on how to do that. And you can upload a shapefile into BITS with a lot of the data that's required in your final report. So again, I encourage you to use those resources that are on the BITS website. Do the tutorials. There's the possibility that we may have more future webinars, but we literally just held some so that the information is very fresh and up to date. But in general, what are you expected to provide in your final report? You're essentially going to be telling us what practices were constructed. You're going to be telling us about the load reductions that were achieved by those practices, whether it's phosphorus, nitrogen, sediment, TSS as such, and by how much they were reduced, and associated modeling information. We're going to be looking at whether the project was implemented according to the grant agreement via the information you're providing in your final report. And just again, looking for consistency with code, statute, and the funding requirements. Along with the report content itself, you're going to have certain attachments that you've always been expected to provide. Now you'll be uploading them into BITS. So this list has not changed. We expect pre and post implementation photos. We want you to provide an aerial photo map with the BMP sites labeled. You will also have the ability to locate your practices on a map, GIS in a GIS fashion, in BITS. But we also like having that aerial photo map at this point. Right now, we don't have the functionality to generate maps from the mapping function in BITS, but we hope to soon. So for the time being, we want you to have that aerial photo map showing the practices. We want to see that load reduction modeling documentation. You'll have to upload that. If you've committed to doing some water quality monitoring, that's another place where you can provide the monitoring results. That happens very seldom, but if you did in your project evaluation strategy, there's a place for that. So the good thing is if you've got multiple practices, some of these attachments apply to multiple practices. And so you can upload your attachments at the project level, and then you can assign those attachments to each applicable BMP in your project. So like I said, some of them may be applicable to like the load reduction modeling documentation. That may encompass multiple practices. Well, it would be the same load reduction modeling documentation that you could then attach to each applicable practice. All right, so we're winding down here. Last but not least, I wanted to just remind you all that you have points of contact. You're not alone in implementing your projects. Your regional non-point coordinators are there to help. Joanna and I are here to help as well. And we really highly recommend that you ask questions early and often rather than guess or assume. It'll make things go a lot better along the way and help you, like I said, get that reimbursement ultimately processed sooner rather than later. So we'll keep you posted. Those of you in Northeast region, we'll keep you posted about hopefully filling the vacancy in the Oshkosh office. I know Erin is chomping at the bit for that. But please contact Erin if you are in Northeast region in one of those areas. Yeah, so that's mainly it. I just want to encourage you to not be shy about asking questions. And speaking of, now is an opportunity to ask another batch of questions if you'd like to.
That was great, Corinne. I'm looking to see here if we have anything that's coming in. There's nothing at the moment, but we'll give folks
All right.
a little bit of time here.
Hopefully we have a good construction season, weather-wise and such.
Absolutely.
See what Mother Nature brings us.
And just a reminder for everyone, we will be processing the video here in the coming week or two and getting that out to folks hopefully in early February. Still not seeing any questions coming in, so we may be wrapping up early today.
All right, before we do that, I'm going to make a plug for Joanna. Like we said before, Joanna is our runoff management grants coordinator. And for those of you that are interested in Urban Nonpoint Source planning grants, applications are out for the next round of Urban Nonpoint Source planning grants, the applications are due April 17th. And those grants would start on January 1st of 2024. So this next January. So there too, if you're interested in a planning grant, get in touch with your regional non-point coordinator. It is a requirement that you connect with them and talk about your planning projects. Joanna will be having grant webinars, both for the targeted runoff management grant program and the Urban Nonpoint Source planning grant program later in February. Some of you may have seen notices about that. If you have any questions about that, feel free to get in touch with Joanna, and we encourage you to apply. Otherwise, if we don't have questions on the construction side, hope you all are successful in getting the ball rolling with your projects. And thank you for attending today. And thanks to Dan, Whitney, and Joanna for helping me out. And hope you have a good rest of the week.
Absolutely. Thanks, Corinne. You did a great job. And thanks everyone for joining. Have a good day.
Thank you.